because I think tyranny has been around a long time. A lot of times when they will criticize me or people like you who believe in liberty, you want to go back to the dark ages. They want to regress. And it's exactly the opposite. The people who object to what we believe in want to go back to the dark ages of tyranny and huge government and tyrants and kings and pharaohs and the people who want to control our lives. And that is, I think that's over and done with.
The trouble is, Americans have been taught to treat political boundaries with an idolatrous reverence, like they are sacred things that have come down to us from heaven. They are no such thing. At best, they are merely utilitarian things. If they work at whatever their function is supposed to be, then they work. If they don't, they don't. That was Thomas Jefferson's view. He wasn't going to worship an idol. Jefferson said, well, you know, this Confederacy could split into 2 or 3 smaller units, and, you know, maybe that would work. You know, it's just a utilitarian thing. We'll have to wait and see.
No people and no part of a people shall be held against its will in a political association it does not want. Simple. According to Spooner, the U.S. regime waged the war on behalf of the opposite principle. The principle on which the war was waged by the North was simply this: that men may rightfully be compelled to submit to and support a government they do not want, and that resistance on their part makes them traitors and criminals. Spooner continued, no principle that it is possible to be named can be more self-evidently false than this, or more self-evidently fatal to all political freedom. It had triumphed in the field and is now assumed to be established. If it really be established, the number of slaves, instead of having been diminished by the war, has been greatly increased. For a man thus subjected to a government that he does not want is a slave, and there is no difference in principle, but only in degree, between political and chattel slavery. The former, no less than the latter, denies a man's ownership of himself and the products of his labor, and asserts that other men may own him and dispose of him and his property for their own uses and at their own pleasure.
Large centralized states have become mystical, self-justifying goals. They need no further rationale. Moreover, people who claim to favor diversity but who favor political centralization are, shall we say, confused.
Us, those who are living in the military-industrial complex, and they're living off the government, and they control the government, they have control of the Federal Reserve and the banking system. That 1% need to be, called upon, and we need to get rid of that by getting rid of the power of government to take care of that part of the 1%.
If California were a separate country, it would have the 7th largest economy in the world. Texas would have a larger GDP than Brazil. Florida's would be larger than Australia's. If you combine Illinois and Ohio, its would be larger than Canada's. But we're not even allowed to think that maybe this might be, living on a smaller political scale might be a more humane way to live. We need large states for security. We can come up with many contrary examples of small states defeating large ones getting bogged down in small states. Tribes in Afghanistan defeating the Soviet Union, or the Greek city-states defeating the Persian Empire. We have the city-state of Venice for 1,200 years. We have the case of Switzerland.
If public sentiment is for secession, if public sentiment is for something peaceful yet radical to dismantle or reduce the federal government, then I think that there will be an incentive on the part of those who make these decisions to go along with public sentiment. One interesting proposal about secession is not total secession, but partial secession. The United States of America would become a federation of about 10 smaller countries, the Northeast, the Southwest, etc. And those countries would have different levels of freedom. And you could, as Ronald Reagan once said, vote with your feet.
In the first Congress in 1790, there was one representative for every 30,000 Americans. Then in 1910, Congress capped the number of members of the House of Representatives permanently at 435. And we now have one representative for about every 713,000. If this ratio of representatives to Americans had held in 1790, there would have been about 4 members of the House of Representatives. If the older ratio held today, there would be well over, in fact, 10,000 members of the House of Representatives. Congress and the President spend about $3 trillion a year. That's 435 representatives, 100 senators, and 1 president. having that much financial power. And the more territorial units you have, the more pressure there is on the political leaders of these places not to oppress the public. And these leaders will lose their tax, suckers, if they impose too many unjust burdens on the people. So they are restrained by the presence of competition. When the British acknowledged the independence of the colonies, which were then states, it acknowledged not the independence of the United States as a single blob, but as a group of states which they listed one by one.
No, secession is a good principle. Just think of the benefits that would have come over these last 230-some years if the principle of secession had existed. That means the federal government would always have been restrained not to overburden the states with too much federalism, too many federal rules and regulations. Not un-American to think about the possibility of secession. This is something that is voluntary. We came together voluntarily. A free society means you can dissolve it voluntarily. That's what the whole issue was about.